The transport shuttle's landing thrusters kicked up a storm of violet dust that tasted like copper and regret. Margot Dunhill stood at the viewport, her 14-month-old son Tobias squirming against her chest, and watched as the landscape of Pellucid 7 materialized through the settling particles. She had expected desolation. She had not expected the planet to look quite so much like her future felt. "Final destination," announced the shuttle's pilot, a weathered man named Guthrie, who had spent the entire 6-hour journey from Carthage Station making sympathetic noises and offering her protein bars with the apologetic air of someone feeding a stray cat. Sector 47 Dunhill Survey Claim. Such as it is. Such as it is. Margot had heard variations of that phrase 17 times in the past 3 weeks, ever since the reading of her husband's will. Such as it is, meaning worthless, meaning you poor thing, meaning Calder's brothers got everything that mattered, and you got a participation trophy in the form of real estate nobody wanted. "You know," Guthrie added, scratching the grey stubble on his chin, "I've been running cargo routes through this sector for 28 years. Never once have I delivered a passenger to Sector 47. Supplies, sure, emergency beacon replacements for abandoned equipment. But a person who intended to stay." He shook his head slowly. "That's a first." "I'll make sure to mention it in your memoirs," Margot replied, and was rewarded with a bark of surprised laughter. She gathered her 2 cases, one containing clothes and supplies, the other holding everything she had left of Calder, and walked down the shuttle's ramp into the strange air of her new home. The dome stood exactly where the coordinates promised, about 40 meters from the landing pad. It was a Harkness model surveyor's habitat, the kind that colonial expansion companies had scattered across 1,000 worlds during the great mineral rush of the previous century. This one looked every day of its 63 years. The curved walls were more rust than original cream-colored composite, a color Margot decided to charitably describe as sunset orange rather than tetanus waiting to happen. Solar panels tilted at drunken angles across its roof like a hat knocked askew in a bar fight. The airlock door hung slightly open, its seal clearly compromised years ago, creaking softly in the wind with the mournful persistence of a forgotten gate. Around the dome, the alien landscape stretched in all directions, like a fever dream, painted by someone who had never quite grasped what normal plants were supposed to look like. The vegetation ranged from knee-high stalks, topped with bioluminescent crystals that glowed faintly even in daylight, to towering structures that might have been trees if trees had been designed by a committee of architects who couldn't agree on anything except that branches should definitely point in more directions than up. Some of the smaller plants oozed a substance that caught the light in ways that seemed almost deliberate, as if the planet itself was showing off. "It's quite something, isn't it?" Guthrie said, having followed her down the ramp with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his no-refunds policy. "The xenobiologists call them crystal ferns. Apparently, the bioluminescence has something to do with the planet's magnetic field. Very scientific explanation, way over my head. All I know is they make navigation tricky at night. The glow confuses the instruments, something fierce." "Ma'am," Guthrie said, "you sure about this? I could take you back to Carthage. There's assistance programs for widows, especially with little ones." "I'm sure." Margot's voice came out steadier than she felt. "This is what my husband left me. This is where I'll stay." Guthrie shifted his weight. "It's just, Pellucid 7 isn't exactly hospitable. The Venari Confederation has territorial claims on the northern continent. The atmosphere's breathable, but the pollen count during bloom season will make you wish it wasn't. And the nearest human settlement is Outpost Brindley, 18 kilometers northeast. I read the briefing files." She turned to face him, Tobias now gnawing contentedly on the collar of her jacket. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Guthrie, truly, but I've made my decision." He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Supply runs come through every 40 days. Emergency beacons on frequency 773. You need anything before then. The Venari at the trading post in the valley. He pointed toward a distant cluster of structures visible through the haze. They're decent enough for aliens. Name's Chelric, runs the place. Mention my name. Margot watched the shuttle rise and disappear into the greenish sky, its engine noise fading until all she could hear was the whisper of wind through the strange plants surrounding her new home. Some of them glowed faintly, bioluminescent crystals embedded in their stalks, she remembered from the planetary survey. Harmless, apparently, just another oddity in a galaxy full of them. Tobias made a questioning sound. I know, little one, she murmured, adjusting his weight against her hip. It's not much, but it's ours. The interior of the dome was, improbably, worse than the exterior. 63 years of abandonment had not been kind. The main living space was a single circular room, roughly 8 meters in diameter, with a partition wall sectioning off what had once been sleeping quarters. A film of dust covered everything: the fold-out table, the defunct cooking unit, the cracked display screens that lined one curved wall. Something had built a nest in the ventilation shaft. Margot could see the trailing fibers of some alien plant material poking through the grate like nature's own bad hairpiece. The smell was memorable, not precisely unpleasant, more like what you might get if you left a library and a mushroom farm in a sealed room for half a century and asked them to sort out their differences. There were notes of old metal, ancient dust, and something organic that Margot decided not to investigate too closely. Well, she said aloud, setting down her cases, I've stayed in worse hotels. This was not technically true, but it felt like the kind of thing a person should say in this situation. Tobias, completely unperturbed by his surroundings, chose this moment to grab a fistful of her hair and attempt to consume it. But the structure was sound. She checked the walls, the support struts, the floor panels. Solid. Whoever had built this place 63 years ago had built it to last, which was more than could be said for most marriages, careers, or kitchen appliances she had encountered. Environmental systems are offline, she said aloud, more to hear a human voice than because Tobias could understand. Power cells are drained. Water recycler needs a complete overhaul. The cooking unit appears to have given up on existence entirely, but the bones are good. The bones are definitely good. She set Tobias down on a relatively clean patch of floor, relatively being a term she was applying generously, and began unpacking. The supply case contained enough dehydrated rations for 3 months, water purification tablets, a portable heater, medical supplies, and the tools she'd need to make this place livable. The second case, Calder's case, she set aside without opening. Not yet. She wasn't ready for that yet. The first week was survival, served with a side of creative profanity. Margot worked 18-hour days, stopping only to feed Tobias and catch fragments of sleep when exhaustion made continuing impossible. She replaced the airlock seals with patch compounds from her kit, a process that required lying on her back in awkward positions while alien dust settled into her eyes and ears. She jury-rigged the solar panels into something approaching functionality, which involved climbing onto the dome's curved roof, not designed for climbing, and nearly sliding off twice into the crystal ferns below, which she suspected would have been beautiful, but uncomfortable. She cleared the ventilation shaft, evicting its occupant, a creature like a cross between a spider and a thistle that regarded her with what might have been indignation before scuttling off into the alien brush. It paused at the edge of the clearing and looked back at her, its multiple eyes reflecting the light of the setting sun, and Margot could have sworn its posture communicated something along the lines of, This isn't over, large interloper." "Don't let the door hit you," she called after it. On the fourth day, she discovered that the cooking unit's problems were beyond repair. Some crucial component had corroded into a solid mass that looked like modern art and smelled like defeat. She improvised a heat source using the portable heater and a metal container from the supply kit, which produced results that were technically food in the same way that a shuttle was technically a vehicle. Both would get you where you needed to go, but neither would be pleasant about it. Tobias did not complain about the cooking. Tobias did not complain about anything, really. As long as he was fed, warm, and allowed to put things in his mouth, he was in many ways the ideal colonist. The water recycler defeated her. The internal components were corroded beyond her ability to repair, and she didn't have replacement parts. She would need to trade for them, which meant she would need something to trade. On the 8th day, she walked to the Venari trading post. The Venari were not what she expected. The briefing files had described them as reptilian humanoids, which was technically accurate in the same way that describing a symphony as organized noise was technically accurate. They stood roughly 2 meters tall, their bodies covered in scales that shifted color depending on the light. Deep emerald in shadow, almost golden when the sun caught them. Their faces were elongated, almost canine, with large amber eyes that seemed to track multiple things simultaneously. They moved with a fluid grace that made Margot acutely aware of her own clumsy human locomotion. She had also read that Venari scales were mood indicators, which seemed like a severe evolutionary disadvantage in terms of poker playing ability. Imagine trying to bluff when your face literally changed colors based on your feelings. Then again, perhaps honesty was valued more highly in their culture. Perhaps the whole deception thing was a uniquely human contribution to the galactic community, like jazz music and the tendency to invade places for vague ideological reasons. The trading post was a series of interconnected domes, larger and better maintained than her own, arranged around a central courtyard where several Venari conducted business with a handful of other species Margot didn't recognize. One appeared to be roughly spherical, with multiple eye stalks. Another was essentially a walking tree that communicated through rustling sounds. And the third looked disconcertingly like a large cat wearing a business suit, which Margot decided not to think about too hard. She found Chelric behind a counter in the main structure, sorting through a crate of electronic components with 3-fingered hands that moved with surprising delicacy. He looked up as she entered, his scales rippling through several shades of blue before settling on a neutral gray. "Human," he said. His voice was surprisingly melodic, with an undertone like wind through reeds. The widow from the Dunhill claim. "Word travels fast. Sound travels faster. Your shuttle landing disturbed my afternoon meditation." He tilted his head, studying her in that unnerving, multi-focused way Venari had. "Guthrie mentioned you might come. Said you were either very brave or very foolish to stay in that ruin. Which do you think?" "I think the distinction rarely matters. Both tend to end in interesting stories, one way or another." Chelric set down the component he'd been examining. "What do you need?" "Water recycler parts, Harkness model Series 4, the filtration membrane and the condensation coils, specifically." "I have those." He named a price that made Margot's stomach clench. It was more than she had. It was more than she would have for months, even if she somehow found work in a trading post on a backwater planet, populated primarily by aliens who communicated through color changes and rustling. "I can offer labor," she said. "I'm a certified systems technician. I can repair, install, calibrate. I have repair specialists. What I lack is what you lack. Currency." Chelric's scales flickered orange, which Margot had read indicated something like sympathy, or possibly indigestion. The xenocultural briefings had been frustratingly vague on the nuances. The Dunhill claim was surveyed and abandoned 40 years before you were born, human. There is nothing of value there. Everyone knows this. My husband believed otherwise. Your husband is dead. Ah, the words hung in the air between them. Margot felt Tobias shift against her chest. She had him in a carrying sling now, freeing her hands, and she focused on his warmth to keep her voice steady. Yes, she said, he is, but he left me that claim for a reason. He was not a cruel man or a stupid one. There is something there. I just need time to find it. Chelric regarded her for a long moment. Then slowly, his scales shifted to a pale lavender that Margot didn't recognize from any of her research. I will extend credit, he said. 60 days. If you cannot pay by then, I will pay. If you cannot, he continued as if she hadn't spoken, I will require the claim itself as collateral. Worthless as it is, it has some value as salvage. The dome materials could be repurposed. Margot thought of the rust-streaked walls, the tilting solar panels, the floor she had just spent a week scrubbing clean. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Agreed, she said. The package arrived 2 days later, delivered by a young Venari whose scales hadn't yet settled into adult patterns. Margot installed the parts that night, working by the light of a portable lamp, while Tobias slept in the makeshift crib she'd assembled from storage containers and spare padding. The recycler hummed to life at 2 in the morning, its display flickering through diagnostic screens before settling on a steady green. Clean water, breathable air, heat, the basics of survival secured. Margot sat on the floor of her dome and cried for the first time since Calder's funeral. She hadn't meant to marry a surveyor. She had meant to marry a doctor or an engineer, or perhaps, in her more romantic moments, a musician, someone stable, someone whose work didn't take them to the edges of mapped space for months at a time. Someone who would be there when she woke up in the morning and not 6 star systems away calibrating equipment. Her mother had very specific ideas about the kind of man Margot should marry. These ideas involved steady income, predictable schedules, and absolutely no mention of geological anomalies at the dinner table. Find someone boring, her mother had advised. Boring is underrated. Boring men come home on time and don't get eaten by alien wildlife. But she had met Calder Dunhill at a transit station on Meridian 3, both of them delayed by the same ion storm, and within 20 minutes of conversation she had known, with a certainty that surprised her, that her plans had changed. Her mother's advice had suddenly seemed less like wisdom and more like a recipe for a life unlived. He was not handsome in any conventional sense, too thin, too angular, with a nose that had been broken at least twice, and hair that defied any attempt at organization, perpetually sticking up in ways that suggested either genius or the absence of mirrors. But his eyes were kind, and his laugh was genuine, and when he talked about the worlds he had seen, the crystal caves of Penthos, the singing deserts of Ashkarim, the impossible vertical forests of Venari Prime, Margot found herself leaning closer, drawn in by the wonder in his voice. You make it sound beautiful, she had said, 3 hours into that first conversation, when the ion storm showed no signs of abating and neither did their dialogue. It is beautiful, he had replied. Most people look at planets and see resources, minerals to extract, land to develop, ecosystems to categorize. I look at planets and see stories. Every geological formation has a history. Every mineral deposit is a record of something that happened millions of years ago. The universe is constantly writing in stone, and my job is to read it. That was the moment, she later realized, when she had fallen irretrievably in love. Not with his looks or his prospects or his stability rating, with his perspective. with the way he saw wonder in rocks and poetry and data readings. They married 4 months later, in a ceremony her mother attended with the resigned expression of someone watching a train wreck in slow motion. Tobias came along 11 months after that, and 5 months after Tobias's birth, Calder Dunhill collapsed during a routine survey expedition on Pellucid 7, victim of a cardiac event that no one could have predicted and no one could have prevented. His brothers, Edmund and Fletcher, had handled the estate. They were corporate men, both of them, high-ranking executives in the Carthage mining consortium that had employed Calder. They had never approved of his marriage to a woman without family connections or significant assets. They had made that disapproval clear in 1,000 small ways over the years. The condescending comments at family gatherings, the pointed questions about her career prospects, the gifts for Tobias that somehow always came with subtle implications that Margot wasn't providing adequately. Edmund, the eldest, was the worst. He had the smooth manner of a man who had learned to hide his contempt behind expensive suits and practiced smiles. He called Margot dear in a tone that made it sound like a synonym for insignificant. The will, when it was read, had made their feelings clearer still to Edmund. The family home on Carthage Station, the investment portfolio, the mining rights to 17 active claims across 4 star systems. To Fletcher, the company's shares, the pension benefits, the rights to all technological patents Calder had developed during his employment. To Margot, survey claim 7 Gamma 47 on Pellucid 7, commonly known as the Dunhill claim, along with all structures and contents therein. A worthless patch of land on a backwater world. An old dome that no one had occupied in over 60 years. That was her inheritance, her widow's portion, her future. The lawyer reading the will, a man named Pemberton, whose sympathies clearly lay with the Dunhill brothers, had delivered this last item with a slight pause, as if he expected Margot to object. She had not given him the satisfaction. Edmund had smiled when the terms were read. Fletcher had looked almost embarrassed. He had always been the more human of the two, capable of occasional moments of shame, even if he never acted on them. "You understand," Edmund had said in that smooth voice she had always despised, "that Calder's wishes were quite specific. We are simply honoring his intent. Family matters are delicate, and we want to make sure everyone feels that the process has been fair." "Fair," Margot had repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Indeed, Calder was always unconventional in his thinking. He saw value in strange places. Perhaps he believed this claim would suit you. Edmund's smile had not reached his eyes. "After all, you're both somewhat provincial." His intent, Margot had replied, forcing her voice to remain steady, was to provide for his wife and son. And he has. You have a home now, property. Most widows would be grateful. She had not screamed. She had not wept. She had gathered her dignity and her son and walked out of that office with her head held high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Behind her, she heard Edmund say something to Fletcher in a low voice, followed by soft laughter. But later, alone in the temporary housing the company had provided for exactly 30 days, she had stared at the claim documents and wondered if Calder had truly meant to abandon her, or if his brothers had found some way to manipulate the will without leaving evidence. She would never know for certain, but she knew this. Calder Dunhill had loved her. He had loved their son. He would not have left them with nothing, unless nothing was more than it appeared. The box was in her second case, the one she hadn't opened. She had carried it from their quarters on Carthage Station, carried it through the transport hub and onto the shuttle and across the violet dust of Pellucid 7, and she had not looked inside. The grief was too fresh, the memories too sharp, But now, in the quiet of her 23rd night on the claim, with the recycler humming and Tobias sleeping and the wind whispering against the dome's walls, Margot finally unlaced the case and lifted the lid. Calder's survey tools, his field jacket still smelling faintly of the soap he had used, his battered datapad, which she had assumed was wiped clean by company security protocols. It wasn't. Margot's breath caught as the screen flickered to life, responding to her thumbprint. Calder had added her biometrics years ago, just in case. The home screen showed dozens of files organized into folders with dates and location codes, survey data, field notes, personal logs, and one folder labeled simply, "For Margot." She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single video file and a document titled Instructions. She played the video first. Calder's face filled the screen, thinner than she remembered, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had recorded this after too many sleepless nights. He was sitting somewhere she didn't recognize. Not their quarters, not his office. Behind him, she could see curved walls, a dome. This dome, she realized with a start. He had recorded this here, on Pellucid 7. He was wearing his field jacket, the same one currently folded in the case behind her, and he looked tired in a way that went deeper than simple exhaustion. He looked tired in a way that spoke of carrying a heavy secret for too long. "Margot," he said, and his voice made her chest ache. "My darling Margot, if you're watching this, then I'm gone, and my brothers have done what I expected them to do. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you from them directly. But I can protect you another way. Please, listen carefully." Margot paused the recording, drew a breath, reminded herself that whatever came next, she needed to hear it. Then she pressed play again. "The claim," Calder's recording continued, "is not worthless. I know that's what everyone thinks. I know that's what my brothers wanted everyone to think. 40 years ago, when this survey station was established, the preliminary scans showed nothing of value. No mineral deposits, no rare elements, nothing worth extracting. The station was abandoned within a year, written off as a loss, and everybody moved on to shinier prospects." He paused, rubbing his eyes with a gesture Margot remembered from 100 late nights when he'd been wrestling with survey data that didn't make sense. But the preliminary scans were wrong, or rather, they were right about the surface. It's what's underneath that matters. The recording cut to a different angle. Calder standing now, moving through the dome's interior. The space looked cleaner than when Margot had arrived, though still clearly abandoned. He was pointing at the floor with the intensity of a man who had spent months thinking about this moment. The original surveyors only scanned the first 50 meters of substrate. Standard protocol for planetary assessment. Quick, efficient, cost-effective, all the words corporations love. What they didn't know, what nobody knew until I came back here 3 years ago, is that there's a chamber system starting at 60 meters depth. Natural formations carved out over millions of years by underground water flow that dried up long before humans ever left Earth. And in those chambers, Margot, there's a deposit of synthesium. Margot's hand flew to her mouth. Synthesium, the rarest element known to human civilization, used in the manufacture of advanced medical technology, faster than light communication arrays. The neural interfaces that allowed humans to interface with complex AI systems. A single gram was worth more than most people earned in a decade. A significant deposit would be worth more than some planetary economies. "I know what you're thinking," Calder said, as if he could see her face through the screen across the years. "How did nobody notice this before? How did the original survey miss it?" He smiled, that crooked, self-deprecating smile she had fallen in love with. "Because synthesium doesn't show up on standard scans. It has a unique crystalline structure that absorbs detection frequencies rather than reflecting them. The original surveyors weren't looking for it. They weren't expecting it. And because they weren't expecting it, They never recalibrated their equipment to account for the possibility. I discovered it by accident, Calder continued. A equipment malfunction that forced me to recalibrate my scanners to a deeper range. I saw the readings, I verified them, and then I realized I had a choice to make. His face filled the screen again, his expression complicated. If I reported this through official channels, the consortium would claim it. They would invoke the corporate discovery clause in my contract, and every gram of synthesium would belong to them. My brothers would make sure of it. They've been looking for an excuse to edge me out for years, and a discovery this valuable would give them exactly the leverage they needed. He smiled, a sad, tired smile that Margot had never seen on his face during their marriage. So I didn't report it. I filed a standard null-value assessment, same as everyone else who had surveyed this claim over the decades. I buried my real findings in personal files that company security would never think to check. And then I started planning. The document explained everything. Calder had spent 2 years quietly transferring ownership of the claim from the consortium's inactive assets to his personal holdings, a complex legal maneuver that had required dozens of small steps, none of which had triggered any corporate alerts. By the time he died, the claim was entirely his to dispose of as he wished. The will, leaving it to Margot, was legally unassailable. My brothers will give you everything else, Calder had written. They'll think they've won. Let them think it. The claim is what matters. The synthesium is there, Margot, roughly 400 kilograms of it, based on my estimates. Even at the most conservative market values, that's enough to secure your future and Tobias's future and the future of your grandchildren. There were technical specifications for accessing the chamber system. A maintenance hatch in the floor, hidden beneath a section of paneling that looked identical to the rest. There were instructions for extracting the synthesium safely, for processing it into transportable form, for selling it through legitimate channels without alerting the wrong people. And there was one final message. I'm recording this because I know my heart is failing. I've known for months. The company doctors wanted to send me back to Carthage for treatment, but I refused. I needed to finish preparing everything first. I needed to make sure you would be protected. Calder's face was wet with tears now. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you in person. I'm sorry I kept this secret. I was afraid that if you knew, you might let something slip and Edmund would find out. He has spies everywhere. I couldn't risk it. He reached toward the camera, as if touching her through the screen. I love you, Margot. I love our son. This is the only way I knew to prove it. Please, find the chamber, take what's there. Build a life for yourself and Tobias. And don't let my brothers win. Don't ever let them win. The recording ended. Margot sat in the darkness for a long time, the data pad clutched to her chest, Calder's voice echoing in her memory. He had known. He had been dying, and he had known, and instead of spending his final months with his family, he had been working, planning, scheming to protect them from his own brothers. The grief washed over her again, fresh and terrible. But underneath it now was something else, something harder, something that felt almost like hope. She moved the sleeping Tobias to his crib, then returned to the main room with a handlight. The panel Calder had described was in the northeast section of the floor, 3 meters from the wall. She pried it up with a multi-tool and found exactly what he had promised. A maintenance hatch, its edges dusty, but its mechanism still functional. The ladder descending into darkness was narrow and steep. Margot climbed down carefully, her light casting wild shadows on the stone walls. 10 meters, 20, 30. The air grew cooler, damper, carrying a mineral scent she didn't recognize. At 60 meters, the shaft opened into a cavern. Margot swept her light across the space and gasped. The walls glittered. not with the uniform shine of metal ore, but with an ethereal, shifting luminescence that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Synthesium. Veins of it running through the rock, clusters of it growing from the cavern floor like crystalline flowers, a king's ransom, an emperor's ransom, embedded in the bones of an alien world. "Oh, Calder," she whispered, "you wonderful, impossible man." She did not rush. That was the key, she understood. Calder had spent years preparing. She could spend months executing. Any sudden change in her circumstances would attract attention, would make Edmund and Fletcher suspicious, would potentially bring the whole careful structure crashing down like a house of cards in a windstorm. So, she lived simply. She repaired what needed repairing, making do with improvised solutions and second-hand parts. She planted a small garden using seeds from her supply kit, learning through trial and error which earth plants could coexist with Pellucid 7's strange soil chemistry, and which would wither dramatically within days. She walked to Chelric's trading post every few weeks, trading small tasks and labor for the supplies she needed, building a reputation as a capable, if unremarkable, widow, making the best of limited circumstances. The locals, both Venari and the handful of other species who passed through the trading post, began to know her, the spherical alien with the eye stalks, whose name translated roughly to comfortable observation of distant objects, taught her which local plants were safe to eat and which would cause hallucinations, ranging from mildly entertaining to deeply regrettable. The walking tree, called Whisper of Settling Dust in its own language, occasionally left small gifts of bioluminescent fungi outside her dome, which Margot interpreted as either friendship or a very slow-motion invasion. Chelric himself became something approaching a friend, or at least a friendly acquaintance. He was curious about human customs, particularly the ones that made no logical sense, which, as he pointed out, was most of them. "You celebrate the anniversary of your planet, completing an orbit around its star by consuming excessive calories and making promises you cannot keep," he observed one afternoon. His scales flickering with the lavender shade Margot had learned indicated bemused puzzlement. "This is considered normal. It's called a birthday party, and yes. And the promises? New Year's resolutions. They're mostly aspirational." Aspirational. Chelric considered this. "Among my people, we do not make promises we do not intend to keep. It is considered dishonest. Among humans, we make promises we don't intend to keep all the time. It's called politics." His scales rippled through several colors before settling on something that might have been laughter. But at night, when Tobias slept, she descended into the cavern. Calder's instructions were precise. The synthesium couldn't simply be chipped out of the rock. Impurities would contaminate it, rendering it worthless. Instead, she used a combination of thermal cycling and chemical treatment to extract the pure element in small quantities, building up a reserve of processed material that she stored in a shielded container Calder had hidden in the chamber. The work was harder than anything she had ever done. The chamber was cold, perpetually around 4 degrees above freezing, and the air carried a mineral taste that coated her throat. The extraction process required steady hands and absolute concentration. One mistake could ruin hours of work and waste precious resources. Some nights she emerged from the shaft so exhausted that she could barely climb the ladder, her muscles screaming protests she had to ignore. But every gram she extracted was another step toward freedom. There were setbacks. One night, a storm system swept across the region, and lightning struck somewhere near the dome. The power surge damaged her extraction equipment, setting her back 2 weeks while she figured out repairs using parts she had to trade significant favors to obtain. Another time, Tobias developed a fever, and she spent 3 terrifying days nursing him back to health, while the cavern sat untouched, her fear for her son overwhelming everything else. The hardest moments were the ones where grief ambushed her unexpectedly, when she found one of Calder's notes in the equipment manuals, his handwriting cramped but familiar. When Tobias laughed in a way that sounded exactly like his father. When she emerged from the cavern at dawn and saw the crystal ferns glowing in the early light, beautiful beyond words, and had no one to share the sight with. But she kept going, she kept extracting, she kept building her reserve, gram by gram, the weight of her future slowly accumulating in a shielded container 60 meters below the surface of a planet nobody wanted. 6 months after her arrival, Margot paid off her debt to Chelric. The Venari trader's scales cycled through several colors she had never seen before when she placed the payment chips on his counter. The precise amount she owed, converted from a small quantity of synthesium she had sold through a discreet broker on Carthage Station. "You found something," Chelric said. "It wasn't a question. I found my husband's legacy." He was silent for a long moment. Then his scales settled into a warm amber that she had learned indicated respect. "The widow from the worthless claim," he said. "Perhaps not so worthless after all. Perhaps not. Your husband's brothers. They do not know. They believe I am slowly starving to death in a ruin. They send occasional messages expressing hollow concern and reminding me that company housing assistance is available if I admit I cannot survive on my own." Chelric made a sound that might have been a laugh. "And you do not correct them." "I do not." "Wise." He pushed the payment chips back toward her. "Consider this a gift for your son. Buy him something unnecessary. Children should have unnecessary things." Margot looked at the chips, then at Chelric's amber eyes, and felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. Thank me when you have won. For now, you are still in the opening moves." The message came 18 months after Calder's death. Edmund's face appeared on her repaired communication screen, his expression arranged in what he probably thought was brotherly concern. Margot recognized it as the look he wore when closing a deal that would harm everyone but himself. "Margot, dear," he said, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I've come to a decision. The family has a responsibility to young Tobias, regardless of any difficulties between us. I'm coming to Pellucid 7 to see you, to discuss options." Her blood ran cold. "That's not necessary, Edmund. We're managing quite well." "Managing." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've heard reports, Margot, from supply pilots, from trading post contacts, reports suggesting that a destitute widow is somehow thriving on a barren claim. I think it's time we had a conversation about exactly how that's possible." The screen went dark. He arrived 3 weeks later, in a private shuttle that probably cost more than Margot would earn in 5 years of legitimate work. The shuttle descended with the ostentatious noise of expensive engines, kicking up a storm of violet dust that settled on everything within a 50-meter radius, including Margot's freshly washed laundry drying on a makeshift line. Fletcher was with him, looking uncomfortable. He had always been the lesser sibling, following Edmund's lead, without ever quite sharing his ruthlessness. He emerged from the shuttle a few steps behind his brother, his expression suggesting someone who had been dragged to a party he hadn't wanted to attend. Margot met them outside the dome, Tobias on her hip, her expression carefully neutral. She had 3 days' warning to prepare. Chelric had contacts in the trading lanes who monitored incoming ship traffic, and she had used every hour. "Edmund, Fletcher, welcome to my home." Edmund surveyed the property with undisguised contempt. The dome was still weathered, still rust-streaked, Margot had deliberately avoided cosmetic repairs, understanding that appearances mattered more than reality in the game she was playing. The solar panels still tilted at odd angles. From the outside, nothing had changed since her arrival. She looked like exactly what she had appeared to be 18 months ago, a struggling widow making do with scraps. "You've certainly made the most of limited resources," Edmund said, his tone suggesting he had expected to find her living in squalor and was vaguely disappointed to discover otherwise. "I'm impressed you've survived this long. Our financial experts predicted you would return to Carthage within 6 months. Your financial experts underestimated me. Perhaps you should hire better ones." Edmund's smile tightened fractionally. "Perhaps, which raises interesting questions, doesn't it? A widow with no income, no assets, no visible means of support, yet here you are, looking healthy, with a healthy child, having paid off debts that should have been impossible. I work, I trade, I economize. You should try it sometime. You might find it character building." Tobias, demonstrating his excellent sense of timing, chose this moment to blow a raspberry in Edmund's direction. Margot struggled to keep her face straight. "Do you?" Edmund stepped closer. "Or do you have something you're not telling us? Margot? Something Calder might have left you that wasn't in the official inventory?" Margot felt her heart rate spike, but kept her face calm. "Calder left me this dome and this land, nothing more. If you've come looking for hidden treasure, Edmund, I'm afraid you've wasted a trip, though I suppose that's consistent with your other investment decisions." His eyes narrowed. "What would you know about my investments?" "Nothing at all. I'm simply a provincial widow without family connections, remember? What could I possibly know about anything?" Fletcher coughed in a way that might have been covering a laugh. Edmund shot him a look that could have frozen water. "Then you won't mind if we conduct a small survey of our own," Edmund said, recovering his composure, "just to verify that the original assessments were accurate. After all, Calder was the last qualified surveyor to examine this claim, and we both know his judgment was sometimes questionable." She understood then. He suspected. He didn't know what she had found, but he suspected something, and he was here to discover the truth. If he found the synthesium, he would take everything. The claim would be challenged, tied up in corporate litigation for decades. Even if she eventually won, Tobias would be grown before she saw a single credit. "I'll need to see the relevant legal documentation," she said. "Survey rights on private property require owner consent." Edmund's smile widened. "Actually, they don't. Not when there's reason to believe the property was obtained through fraud or misrepresentation. And I have a signed affidavit from a company attorney suggesting that Calder's transfer of this claim may not have been entirely legitimate." He produced a data chip and handed it to her. "This grants us temporary survey authority pending the outcome of a formal investigation. You can cooperate voluntarily, or I can have the local authorities enforce compliance." He paused, savoring the moment. "Your choice." That night, after Edmund and Fletcher had retired to their shuttle, refusing to stay in her quaint accommodations, Margot sat in the darkness and planned. They would find the hatch. They would find the chamber. They would find the synthesium. And when they did, they would use their army of lawyers and corporate connections to take everything, leaving her with nothing but the satisfaction of knowing that Calder had tried, unless she acted first. She descended into the chamber one last time. Over the past 18 months, she had extracted roughly 60 grams of processed synthesium, enough to be comfortable, not enough to be wealthy. The remaining deposit was still there, still glittering in the darkness, worth more money than she could easily comprehend. She couldn't take it all. There wasn't time, and even if there was, suddenly appearing with hundreds of kilograms of synthesium would raise exactly the kind of questions she needed to avoid. But she could do something else. She climbed back up the ladder, and went to Chelric's trading post. "You want to do what?" The Venari's scales had turned a shade of purple that Margot had never seen before. "I want to transfer majority ownership of my claim to a Venari holding company tonight, before Edmund can begin his survey tomorrow morning." Chelric stared at her. "You understand that this would mean—" "I understand exactly what it means. Venari corporate law supersedes human colonial law in disputed territory. If the claim is majority owned by a Venari entity, Edmund's survey authorization becomes void. He would have to petition the Venari Confederation for access, which would take years." Chelric's scales slowly shifted toward amber. "Possibly decades. The Confederation does not respond quickly to human legal requests." "Exactly. And in that time," Margot met his eyes, "in that time I continue extraction under Venari oversight. The holding company receives 40% of all profits. I receive 60%. Tobias inherits my share if anything happens to me." Chelric was silent for a long moment. "You are asking me to make an enemy of powerful humans," he said finally. "The Dunhill brothers have connections throughout the Carthage consortium. They could make trade difficult for my operation. They could. Or they could recognize that fighting the Venari Confederation is more trouble than one widow's inheritance is worth, and quietly move on to other schemes. You gamble. I adapt." Margot leaned forward. "Chelric, I don't know much about Venari culture, but I know this. Your people value cleverness, strategy, the elegant move that accomplishes through intelligence what force cannot. Is this not exactly that?" His scales rippled through several colors before settling on a deep, rich gold she had never seen before. "You have learned well, widow, from the worthless claim." He extended his three-fingered hand. "I believe we have a deal." Edmund's face, when he received the notification the next morning, was something Margot would treasure for the rest of her life. He stood in front of her dome, his expensive clothes already dusty from Pellucid 7's pervasive violet particles, his face cycling through expressions like a buffering video. Shock, disbelief, rage, and finally a kind of paralyzed confusion that suggested his brain was refusing to process what he had just read. "This is impossible," he sputtered. "You can't just—" "The claim was, we have documentation." "Your documentation authorizes a survey of human-owned property," Margot said calmly. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for the past several hours, savoring each syllable. "As of midnight last night, this property is majority-owned by the Chelric Holdings Consortium, a registered Venari commercial entity. I'm afraid your authorization is no longer valid." "That's— You can't." Edmund's voice had gone up half an octave. "Venari law doesn't supersede human colonial law." "Actually, it does. In disputed territories. This sector falls under the Carthage-Venari trade agreement of 73 years ago, which specifically grants Venari commercial entities primary jurisdiction over mixed ownership properties. Your own company helped negotiate that agreement, Edmund. I'm surprised you're not more familiar with it." Fletcher, standing behind his brother, actually laughed, a short, shocked bark that he quickly suppressed. Edmund shot him a look that could have stripped paint. "You think this will protect you?" Edmund hissed, turning back to Margot. "You think hiding behind alien bureaucracy will save you? I will spend the rest of my life dismantling you, Margot. I will destroy everything you—" "You will do nothing," she interrupted, "because here is what will happen if you try." She held up her datapad. "I have records, Edmund, detailed records that Calder kept for years, documenting every manipulation, every fraud, every corner-cutting exercise that you and Fletcher used to enrich yourselves at the company's expense." She paused, watching his face drain of color. "Falsified survey reports, bribed inspectors, safety violations that cost lives, everything documented, verified, and currently sitting in encrypted storage, with instructions to release publicly if anything happens to me or my son." Edmund had gone very still, the kind of stillness that suggested a predator reassessing its prey and finding it considerably more dangerous than expected. "Calder was a surveyor," Margot continued, allowing herself a small smile. "His job was to find things that were hidden. Did you really think he didn't notice what his own brothers were doing? Did you really think he was too busy looking at rocks to pay attention to the things happening right under his nose?" Fletcher had gone pale as well, though his expression was more resigned than outraged. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind whistling through the crystal ferns, and Tobias making happy, gurgling sounds, completely unaware of the drama unfolding around him. "What do you want?" Edmund finally asked. His voice was flat now, stripped of its usual smoothness. "I want you to leave. I want you to never contact me again. I want you to let me raise my son in peace on this land that my husband left me, with the resources that my husband provided." She met his eyes steadily. "That's all." "And if we refuse?" Margot smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had spent 18 months learning exactly how sharp she could be when circumstances required it. "Then I send the files, and we find out whether the Carthage Consortium's board of directors is more interested in protecting 2 executives or in protecting their stock price. I suspect I know the answer, but I'm willing to experiment if you are. I've always believed in the scientific method." Edmund stared at her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his shuttle. Fletcher hesitated. "Margot," he said quietly, "for what it's worth, I'm sorry about Calder, about all of it. I know you are, Fletcher. That's why the files don't include your name anywhere. Only Edmund's." His eyes widened. "Go home," she said. "Find a different path. It's not too late." She watched the shuttle rise and disappear into the greenish sky, just as she had watched Guthrie's shuttle disappear almost 2 years before. But this time, she was not crying. This time, she was smiling. "That was quite a performance," Chelrick said, emerging from where he had been observing behind the dome. "The encrypted files, the threat of exposure, very dramatic." Margot turned to face him. "It was, wasn't it? The files exist, I assume. Calder's documentation exists, whether it contains what I claimed it contains." She shrugged. "Edmund doesn't know, and he never will, because he's not willing to risk finding out." Chelrick's scales flickered through several amused shades. "You would have made an excellent Venari, Margot Dunhill. I'll take that as a compliment." 5 years later, Margot stood on the observation deck of the Dunhill Foundation's new headquarters on Carthage Station, a gleaming structure that housed medical facilities, educational programs, and housing assistance for colonial widows and their children throughout the sector. Tobias, now 6 years old, ran past her with 2 other children, their laughter echoing off the polished walls. He was tall for his age, with his father's angular features and his mother's dark eyes. He didn't remember Calder. He had been too young, but he knew the stories. Margot made sure he knew the stories. The foundation had been her idea, funded by the synthesium extraction that continued under Venari Partnership. 60% to Margot, 40% to Chelrick Holdings, and a significant portion of Margot's share redirected toward ensuring that no widow would ever face what she had faced: the dismissal, the condescension, the assumption that a woman alone with a child was somehow less worthy of consideration. "Mrs. Dunhill?" Her assistant, a young man named Garrison, appeared at her elbow. "Your 3 o'clock is here." Margot nodded and turned toward her office. On the way, she passed a memorial wall, a collection of photographs and plaques honoring those who had made the foundation possible. Calder's picture was at the center. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Calder Dunhill, who knew that the greatest treasures are often hidden where no one thinks to look. Margot touched the plaque gently as she passed. "We did it, my love," she murmured. "We won." In her office, Chelric was waiting. His scales had lightened over the years, showing his age, but his amber eyes were as sharp as ever. "The quarterly reports," he said, sliding a data chip across her desk. "Extraction continues on schedule. Our Venari technicians estimate another 15 years of viable mining before the deposit is exhausted." And Edmund retired quietly. The board encouraged him to pursue other opportunities after certain irregularities came to light in his division. Chelric's scales flickered with amusement. "Nothing to do with us, of course. Simply the natural consequences of sloppy record-keeping." Margot smiled. "Of course." They reviewed the numbers together: profits, reinvestments, charitable disbursements. The foundation had helped over 3,000 families in the past 4 years. Schools had been built, medical care had been provided, lives had been changed. "There is one other matter," Chelric said as they finished. "A young widow has arrived on Pellucid 7. She was given a worthless claim by her deceased husband's family. Distant relatives, very disapproving of the match. She is living in an old survey dome, trying to make the best of limited circumstances." Margot raised an eyebrow. "Is there anything hidden beneath her floor?" "Almost certainly not. The claim truly is worthless." "Then why tell me?" Chelric's scales shifted to that warm gold that Margot had come to recognize as deep affection. "Because she needs help. And because you know, better than anyone, what it means to be underestimated." Margot looked at her friend, her partner, for a long moment. Then she stood. "Arrange transport, I'll go myself." "I thought you might say that." She was halfway to the door when she paused. "Chelric, that first day when I came to your trading post, why did you help me? You didn't know about the synthesium. You had no reason to extend credit to a destitute human widow." The Venari was quiet for a moment. "In our culture," he said finally, "there is a saying, the worth of a being is revealed not in abundance, but in scarcity. You had nothing, Margot Dunhill, and yet you did not ask for charity, you did not despair. You asked for credit and offered labor, and planned for a future that logic suggested would never come." His scales rippled with colors she had learned to read over years of partnership. "I have lived many years and met many beings, humans, Venari, a dozen other species. Most of them, when faced with your circumstances, would have surrendered. You stood in my trading post with your child on your hip and your future in ruins, and you bargained. That is rare. That is valuable. That is worth investing in." Margot blinked back unexpected tears. "Thank you," she said, "for seeing something worth investing in." "Thank yourself. I merely recognized what was already there." Adil, the shuttle to Pellucid 7, departed at sunset, Carthage Station's great windows filling with the amber light of the local star. Margot watched the planet she had once fled grow smaller in the viewport, thinking about the strange path that had brought her here. She thought about Calder, whose love had survived death itself. She thought about Tobias, who would grow up knowing that he was the son of a man who moved worlds to protect his family. She thought about the young widow, waiting in an old dome on a backwater planet, facing a future that seemed impossible. And she thought about flaws, and what could be hidden beneath them, and how the things that look worthless are sometimes the most valuable of all. The shuttle engaged its drive, and the stars stretched into lines, and Margot Dunhill went to do what her husband had done for her, to offer someone a chance when no one else would, to see potential where others saw only failure, to find treasure in the most unexpected places. Behind her, in a dome on an alien world, the synthesium still glittered in the darkness, patient and eternal, waiting to transform another life. to fund another dream, to prove once again that the greatest fortunes are often buried exactly where nobody thinks to look. The end.